My Lords, following on from that very useful contribution from the Noble Lord Dodds, in this group it goes without saying that the amendments on the tensions between the bill and the Windsor framework are crucial, and I do want to commend the Noble Lady Baroness Hoey for leading on this issue, because you brought to light something that we need to understand, and it gets to a general concern about the bill that I have, which is a worry about its workability, both legally and also when it comes into contact with reality, because I fear a rude awakening. A part of that will be the unintended consequences of this bill, which a lot of us have tried to draw attention through committee and so on. That's why I've added my name to Amendment 206, calling for periodic reviews of the Act in terms of its operation as well as its effects. I've also tabled my own amendment on the impact of the Act on domestic production, supply chains and so on, which I'll discuss later. Just before I explain why, I am of course glad to see the Government also recognise the need for a review, and that's very positive. But with all due respect to the Noble Lady, the Minister, I'm afraid that Amendment 205 is just not extensive enough. I was particularly disappointed the consultation is limited to the Welsh Minister, the Scottish Minister and the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, because I wanted to say, well, what about all those other stakeholders who would be affected, and what about the research? So I would really urge the Noble Lady Baroness Merrin to incorporate parts of my own amendment and that of the Noble Lord Lansley and Lord Norton of Louth into her own, to make it have some substance and not just be written down for the sake of it. Amendment 206 really does give a concrete shape to what should be reviewed. I appreciate its focus on independently conducted research, particularly. Now, there's already been some complaint when you can't trust that research because it's by the Tobacco Manufacturing Alliance. I have similar views when I read research by Ash, as it happens, and the Noble Lord who cited himself as though he was kind of neutral observer is part of another lobbying group. I'd rather have neither of you as my trustworthy aim to go to. But I did feel, I did feel myself that quite a lot of important information is missed if we don't have research, so that's why I like it. I felt frustrating during our deliberations at committee that so much information had been overlooked. For example, many neutral academics who have researched the health impacts of vaping, in particular its efficacy in helping people quit smoking, the epidemiology of vaping versus smoking, had been overlooked by the government, and I think that these would be invaluable sources and insights had they been consulted. Also at committee, I suggested that the government should look at research coming out of assessing the impact of the single-use vape ban that came into force last June. My amendment was rejected. But interestingly, early evidence and research, as well as market indicators, show that the majority of adult vapers have transitioned to compliant reusable products. I didn't think they would. They have. That's interesting because it goes against what I'd intuitively thought. However, recent evidence shows that 9% of daily vapers admit purchasing illegal single-use vapes, and more worrying, 15% of former single-use vapers report that they've returned to smoking and or increased their tobacco use. And this sort of research and information is important for us to understand why we need careful monitoring. And with this bill, we're going to need a lot of careful monitoring. So it's why I commend the Noble Lord Lansley's amendment, which asks all the right questions, in my view, to review evidence to discover if the Act will actually reduce rates of smoking. Will it reduce rates of vaping amongst young people and children? Whether the legislation will reduce the use of vaping products for adults. Not a good outcome, but will that be what happens? And one of the constant concerns, what will the economic impact of the law change be on small and micro businesses? Something I'm really worried about in terms of family-run convenience stores and so on. The amendment also usefully differentiates between tobacco, nicotine and vape use, too frequently in discussions elided without distinction. The suggestion of assessing behavioural responses to regulatory regimes introduced by the Act is key, as this Act makes a number of suppositions based on the idea that everything in this bill will have a certain impact on behaviour of consumers and of retailers and other parties. But as this is a novel policy that nobody else has done before, there's no evidence from anywhere else in the world that it will work. We're yet to see if behaviour will change in the way the government allege and the supporters of this bill imagine. So the review will check with reality. My Amendment 207 is more focused on an aspect of the bill's impact we haven't really talked about before now, a structured parliamentary scrutiny of the Act's practical effects on domestic production, supply chains and market behaviour and enforcement in relation to nicotine products. And just to say, there's a whole new industry that's grown up domestically around nicotine products, and I think that they are going to be hit by this bill. This bill represents a significant regulatory intervention in a rapidly evolving market. Regulator interventions of this scale can produce structural consequences beyond their primary intent. So often with bills, when they're passed, we've seen problematic effects afterwards, such as compliance costs altering competitive balance, enforcement capacity not aligned with legislative ambition, lawful operators facing disproportionate burdens, illicit dodgy suppliers adopting more quickly outside the law than lawful businesses striving and straining to comply with law changes. And one area of concern is whether a relatively new, innovative domestic industry is going to be strangled almost before it gets off the ground, that associated with nicotine products. There's manufacturing happening in this country, there's laboratory testing, there's quality assurance, distribution, specialist retail activity, and this will be disproportionately harmed by this legislation, I fear, but the review would find out. Whether it's e-liquids or mixing or bottling in manufacturing or device assembly or quality control or UK-specific compliance schemes and mechanisms or specialist shops, there's a whole ecosystem around this industry in the UK, and this supports, by the way, skilled employment across the country in production, laboratory sciences, logistics, retail management, product safety training and more. And why this matters is there's concern that this bill will actually reshape and perhaps damage supply chains servicing the UK market, making the market more reliant on overseas production, whisper it, Chinese vapes, which, by the way, I use regularly and I won't have a word said against them. But even I know that possibly in the quality scale, they're not so great. But anyway, we're creating quality vapes at home domestically. Domestic production and associated employment operates within UK regulatory oversight and provides greater transparency, traceability and accountability than supply chains that are entirely import-led. In other words, will the bill end up unfairly impacting on best practice, quality, compliant, homegrown industries to the advantage of less rigorous suppliers, etc.? The review, beyond this theme of assessing any unintended consequences and proportionality, does so in a timely fashion of 3 years to allow Parliament early visibility of problems rather than waiting until structural effects are entrenched, and so that if distortions or enforcement gaps emerge, Parliament will have the evidence to address them. And partly that evidence will be gathered from a suggested consultation with a neglected set of stakeholders, those carrying out domestic production activities, and there's lots of them, and the government should talk to them, and representatives of workers in those relevant domestic sector. And I know that the government will want to talk to the workers. And that's all to check that the bill is working as intended. Just to finish off, one of the problems with consensus and the fact that, let's be honest, the official opposition decided not to oppose this bill at a certain point, which I don't know how that happened, means that everybody can nod through something and say, isn't it marvellous? I would say that we need a bit more critical thinking. Scrutiny post-legislation is going to be even more essential. All the reviews in this session need to be enacted for the government's sake.